The tide went out too far that morning, and the gulls did not cry. I felt it before I understood it, the low, wrong hush along the broken coast, the smell of the seabed laid bare where no seabed should be. From the gray wall I looked down on black mud that had not seen the sky in my lifetime, on stranded fish flapping silver in the muck, on the whole gray harbor pulled back like a blanket dragged off a sleeping thing. My wolves felt it too. Along the tide line they stood stiff-legged and uneasy, ears flat, and not one of them would step out onto that exposed shore. Not one except her. She was down at the very edge of the wet, where the water had drawn back to a thin gray line, and she was gathering the stranded fish into a fraying net. A small woman in a mended cloak the color of driftwood, her dark hair bound back against the wind, moving through that dead-quiet flat as though it were any morning and not an omen. The other wolves of Saltvarn watched her from the safe high stones the way you watch a thing you fear will notice you. "The drowned girl," someone said behind me. I did not turn. I knew the voice, Osprith, one of my fisher captains, a broad gray wolf with a broad gray temper. "Look at her, my king, out there when the seas pulled back to nothing. She's calling it up, same as she did before." "She is gathering fish," I said. "She's the reason there's no water," Osprith said, and there was fear under his contempt, the way there always was. "Where she walks, the deep follows, my father said it. Half the hold's drowned once already because of what's in her." I let the silence answer him, but I did not send her away, and I did not tell him he was wrong, and that I would learn was its own kind of cowardice. I had grown skilled at it. Down on the flat, the woman they called Curtsied straightened, one hand pressed to the small of her back, and looked out at the horizon where the gray met the grayer. She stood very still, and then she turned and looked up at the wall, up the whole height of the black stones, and found me among all the wolves gathered there as though she had known exactly where I would be. Her eyes met mine across that distance. They were the deep gray of stormlight, and they were not afraid. Something moved in me then that I had no name for and did not want. A warmth low behind the ribs, in the cold hollow place the sea had carved out of me years ago and never given back. I told myself it was pity. I told myself it was guilt. A king learns to tell himself a great many things. She lifted her net of silver fish, and she did not smile, and she did not flinch from me, and she carried her catch back across the dead flat toward the low huts at the hold's ragged edge where they made her live apart, with the other things the hold was ashamed of. Behind me, my wolves began to murmur about signs and omens and the black years, and the sea, out past the harbor mouth, lay flat and waiting and much too far away. I am Torin, and I am the Alpha King of Saltvarn, though there were nights I thought I had no right to either name. My hold clings to the broken coast like a barnacle to a hull, a fortress of black stormstone built up the throat of a drowned valley, terraced down toward the water, its lowest streets once running right to the tide line. We are wolves of the salt and the wind. We take our living from the gray water and we bury our dead above the reach of the highest tide, and for 400 years we had held this coast against every storm the northern sea could throw at us. And then, when I was young and newly crowned and certain the world would bend to a strong enough will, the deep threw something at us that was not a storm. I still do not have a whole word for it. We call it the sunder for what it did to us. It rose out of the black water on a night with no moon, a mountain that moved, a drowned mountain of gray-plated hide and blind, questing bulk, taller than the gray wall, wider than a war galley, dragging the sea up its flanks in waterfalls as it came. It made a sound as it rose that I have never been able to unhear. Not a roar, but a vast, low, drowning groan, the sound the whole ocean would make if it could grieve. It came up out of the harbor, and it walked into my hold, and the black stone that had turned 400 years of storms parted before it like wet sand. I was on the wall that night. I gave the order. I have told myself in the years since every version of that night that lets me sleep, that there was nothing to be done, that no wolf living could have stood against that thing, that the retreat I called saved the hundreds who lived by spending the streets that drowned, that a king's first duty is the living. All of it is true, and none of it is the thing I actually remember, which is this. I remember the lowhold going under. I remember the water taking the terrace streets where the fisher families lived, street by street, the sea pouring in behind the beast like a debt collected. I remember standing on the gray wall with my whole strong pack around me and my crown on my head, and I remember that I did not go down into the water after them. I called the fallback. I saved the high hold, and I stood on my wall and I watched the low hold drown, and I did not go down. The sunder took what it took and it turned at last, and it sank back into the black deep from which it had come, and it did not rise again. Not for years. Long enough that the hold rebuilt what it could on the higher ground and buried what it could not, and began, the way the living always do, to make the horror into a story it could carry. And every story needs a shape. Every drowning needs a reason. It is easier to bear a thing if a thing can be blamed. They found their reason in a girl. Because one child walked out of the drowned low-hold alive. When the water drew back at last from the ruined streets, when we went down with torches into the black wreck of everything we had failed to save, we found the dead, too many, a grief the hold has never finished paying, and we found, in the flooded shell of a fisher's hut alive, a girl of perhaps 10 years, soaked and gray and calm, sitting on a table above the water line with her knees drawn up, watching us come with those storm-gray eyes. Alive when everyone around her had drowned, alone in the very throat of the flood, untouched. I remember one of my wolves stepping back from her. I remember the word going through us like cold water. How? How does one child live where hundreds die? The water had filled that hut to the roof beams and drained again, and it had drowned her mother and her father and her small brother in the next room, and it had left her sitting dry-eyed on a table with the tide mark on the walls above her head. We should have called it a mercy. We should have wept for the child who lived and thanked whatever there was to thank. Instead, and I let this happen, this too is on me, the hold looked at the one survivor of the drowning and decided she must be the reason for it, that the deep had spared her because she belonged to it, that she was marked, that she was the sunder's own, left behind like a hook in a fish, and that where she went the drowning would follow. They called her the drowned girl, Runna drowned and dry. And they raised her at arm's length, fed but not welcomed, kept at the edge of the hold, and every wolf in Saltvarn learned before they learned anything else that you did not touch the omen. You did not cross her path if you could help it, and that if the deep ever stirred again, it would be because she had called it. I let it happen. I was ashamed to look at her, and I told myself the shame was the sight of the drowning she reminded me of, and I did not understand for years that a man can be ashamed of a thing because it holds up a mirror. She stood in the flood and did not run, and I stood on my wall and did not go down. We were both, in our way, the survivors of that night, and only one of us wore the blame, and it was not the one who had earned it. That was the shape of my hold on the morning the tide went wrong. A king with an old shame under his crown. A woman with another man's guilt hung around her neck. And out past the harbor mouth, the sea drawn back and waiting, and the gulls gone silent, and the deep, I knew it. I felt it in the cold, hollow place behind my ribs, the deep beginning, after all these years, to stir. I went down to her that evening. I told my captains I was walking the lower streets to see that the wrong tide had frightened no one into folly, and that was true enough to say aloud. But my feet took me past the mended fisher streets and down to the ragged edge where the omen hut stood, and I stopped outside the driftwood door of the woman they called Curtsied, and I did not entirely know why. She opened it before I knocked. She stood in the doorway with the last gray light behind her and the smell of the fish she had gutted and salted on her hands, and she looked up at me, the Alpha King, come to her door at dusk, a thing that had surely never happened in her whole shunned life, and she did not bow, and she did not stammer, and she did not shrink. "You feel it too," she said, not a question. "That's why you've come." "Feel what?" I said, because a king does not admit to feeling omens. "The deep is waking," she said simply. "It's been waking for 3 days. I can feel it turning over down there the way you feel a storm in a bad tooth. That's why the tide went wrong this morning. It's not resting anymore." She studied my face. "You feel it, and you've come to ask me if I'm calling it. That's what they'll all want to know when it rises, whether it's my fault." The plainness of it stopped my tongue. I had come, I realized, to do very nearly that, to stand over her and take her measure and decide, for the sake of a frightened hold, whether the old story was true. And she had walked out to meet the accusation the way she had walked out onto the dead flat that morning, unafraid, ready to carry it because she had always carried it. "Is it your fault?" I asked her, bluntly king to whatever she was. "No," she said. "But that's never mattered before, so I don't expect it to matter now." She turned back into the hut, leaving the door open, which I understood after a moment was an invitation, the only kind she had ever likely offered anyone. "You may as well come in, my king. If the deep is rising, we've a great deal to be afraid of, and it isn't me." I ducked under the low lintel into the one small room. It was clean and spare and poor. A pallet, a hearth, ropes of drying fish, a shelf of odd things, a whale's ear bone, a curl of gray coral, a rope of shells strung on gut. And along one whole wall, painted in charcoal and red ochre on the whitewashed stone, a mural, The coast, the harbor, the gray wall, and rising out of the water, drawn with a terrible, careful accuracy, the sunder. She had been drawing it, I understood, for years, studying it. The one wolf in all my hold who had never been allowed to look away from it, drawing it over and over until she knew it the way you know a face you cannot stop seeing. "You draw it," I said. "I remember it," she said. She sat by her small fire and gestured me to the only stool which I did not take, a king towers, it is a habit. "I was 10. I was in the house when it filled. My mother put me on the table and told me the water would go down again, and then the water came and it went over her head and it did not go over mine." She said it without weeping. She had wept it out, I thought, long ago, alone, with no one to hold her while she did. I sat on that table in the dark with the whole sea in the room, and the beast passed by outside. I heard it, that sound it makes, right at the wall, and the water was up to the beam over my head, and it did not take me. It just didn't. And in the morning your wolves came with torches and found me, and I saw the way they looked at me, and I have never once since been looked at any other way. She looked into her fire. So no, I did not call it. I was 10 years old, and I watched my family drown, and the sea would not even do me the kindness of taking me with them. That's the whole curse, my king. I lived. I stood in her poor clean room, and I could not speak, because I knew that shame. It was the twin of my own. She had lived when her family drowned. I had lived on my wall when my hold drowned. The hold had made her carry the blame that by rights was mine, and she had carried it for 20 years without complaint, and I had let her, because it was easier than carrying my own. "Why did it not take you?" I said at last, roughly, because it was the question the whole hold had been afraid to ask her to her face for 20 years. For the first time she hesitated. Then she pushed up her sleeve, and in the firelight I saw it, a mark on the inside of her wrist, pale silver-gray against her skin, that I had taken at a glance for an old scar. It was not a scar. It was a whorl, a spiral like the inside of a shell, like a wave curling back on itself, and in the low light it seemed faintly to catch a shine that had nothing to do with the fire. "I was born with this," she said. "My mother had it too, and her mother. She told me once it was the old blood, the moon blood, she called it, the blood of the wolves who first came to this coast when the coast was young, before the hold, before the wall. She said the deep knew us, that we were made to stand at the edge of the water and not be afraid of it." She pulled her sleeve back down. She said it like it was a small thing, a family story, and then the beast came and the water took her and left me. And I have wondered every day for 20 years whether she was right, and whether that's why. Whether the deep left me because it knew me, and whether that makes me its creature, the way the hold says, or something else. "Something else," I said. It came out of me before I had decided to say it. She looked up at me, surprised. I realized with a low ache that anyone would offer her the kinder possibility, would even entertain it, would stand in her doorway and say something else instead of stepping back the way they always stepped back. And that was the moment the cold hollow behind my ribs, the drowned place, the place that had been empty and aching since the night I gave the order, filled. There is no other word for it. It filled the way a tide pool fills, quiet and complete, a warmth rising into a place I had thought was gone for good. I had spent 20 years certain that whatever men mean when they speak of a fated mate, of the bond, of the one the moon makes for you, had passed me by, that a king who let his hold drown did not get to be given such a thing, did not deserve it. I had brought no mate to Saltfarn. My council had paraded 100 fine wolf women through my hall, and I had turned from everyone, and told myself it was duty, and told myself it was grief, and never once let myself feel the truth, which was that I did not believe I had earned the right to love anyone, having failed to save so many. And now I stood in a cursed woman's poor hut with the smell of salt and smoke around us, and the empty drowned place in me was warm, and I knew, with the plain, sure certainty that such knowing carries, the way you know your own name, that I had been wrong, that I had not been passed over, that the moon had made someone for me after all, and my hold had spent 20 years spitting at her feet. I did not tell her. I did not have the words, and I did not have the right, not yet, not with the shame of her whole ruined life sitting between us like a third person in the room. But she saw something change in my face. She was too sharp not to. "You should go, my king," she said quietly, and there was no coldness in it, only a kind of weary protection, as though she were shielding me from the danger of being seen at her door. "If the deep is rising, your hold will need you, and it will not help them to know their king spent the evening with the drowned girl." She rose and banked her fire and stood, small and steady in her mended cloak. "Come back when it rises, because it will. And when it does, they'll want someone to blame before they want someone to fight, and you'll have to decide which one you'd rather be." I went out into the dark, and I climbed back up through my hold to my cold, high chambers, and I did not sleep. I stood at my window all that night, looking out at the black harbor where the tide had crept back in at last, uneasy and wrong, and I felt the deep turning over beneath it, and I felt the warm, new thing behind my ribs that I had no right to and could not deny, and I understood that both of them were rising at once, the beast and the bond, and that I was going to have to reckon with each of them, at last, whether I had the courage for it or not. The next days were bad, and they got worse. The signs came the way she said they would, the way she alone had read them, 3 days before any of my captains would admit to seeing anything at all. Dead fish came up on the tide, whole shoals of them, silver and staring, poisoned by something rising from the deep water. The wells nearest the harbor turned brackish and foul. Twice in the night the ground shuddered, a long, low tremor rolling up out of the seabed that set the hounds screaming in their kennels and knocked the shells from Runna's shelf. And the water in the harbor turned, I have no better word, wrong. It went dark and glassy and still, too still, the way a pool goes still when something large is holding itself motionless just beneath the surface, and the fisher-wolves would not take their boats out onto it, and stood on the quays looking at that black glass water with the old drowning fear naked on their faces. And they blamed her, of course they blamed her. It began as it always began, in murmurs at the edges of the hold, and it grew. The drowned girl had gone out on the dead flat the morning the tide first went wrong. A dozen wolves had seen her, out there when no one else dared, calling it. She had told the king the deep was rising 3 days before it rose. How had she known, if not because she had woken it? The old story, 20 years quiet, came roaring back to life, because the hold was terrified, and a terrified hold does not want to hear that the horror is nobody's fault and nothing can be done. It wants a throat to put its hands around. It wants a door to nail its fear to, and the door was hers and had always been hers, and they went for it. I came down into the lower hold on the 4th evening, to find a knot of them gathered outside her hut in the dusk. Osprith at the front of them, and a score behind him, and torches, and that low, ugly sound a frightened crowd makes when it has decided what it wants to do and is only waiting for someone to say it first. Runna stood in her doorway. She had a fisher's gutting knife in her hand, not raised, only held, and she was watching them come with those steady storm-gray eyes, and she was alone, and she was not going to run, and I saw with a sick lurch that she was not going to survive the night unless someone stopped it. She feels it before it comes because she's the one bringing it, Osprith was saying, working the crowd, his fear dressed up as certainty. 20 years we've fed her and housed her at the hold's edge, and this is our thanks, she calls the beast back down on us. Drive her out. Drive her into the water where she belongs, and maybe the deep takes back its own and lets us be. Osprith, I did not shout it. I have found that a king rarely needs to shout if he has spent his shouts wisely and kept them few. I walked out of the dark into the torchlight, and the crowd came apart around me, and Osprith turned, and the certainty went out of his face and left the fear behind it bare. You will step back from her door. My king, he began. You will step back from her door, I said again, and you will take these wolves to their homes, and in the morning you will help ready the gray wall because the deep is rising and I would rather have your hands on the barricades than around a woman's throat. I let my eyes go over the crowd, and one by one they found somewhere else to look. Hear me, all of you. The sunder is coming. I feel it as you feel it. And when it comes, we will meet it as a pack, every wolf who can hold a spear on the wall together. What we will not do, and here I looked at Runna, standing in her doorway with her small knife and her steady eyes, and I made myself say it, made myself say the true thing at last, the thing I had failed to say for 20 years. What we will not do is drown a woman to buy ourselves a lie. The lowhold did not fall because of her. It fell because of the beast. And because, I said, and my voice did not shake, though the shame in it was old and deep, because your king called the fall back and did not go down into the water after those he was sworn to protect. If you want a wolf to blame for the drowning, blame me. I have earned it. She has not. She was 10 years old. Silence in the torchlight. I had never said it aloud, not in 20 years. Not to my council, not to the fisher families whose kin I had let the water take, not to myself in any words plain enough to bleed. I had let a child carry it instead. And I watched the hold hear their king say it, and I watched something shift in the faces around me, not forgiveness. It was too soon and too raw for forgiveness, but a loosening, the first crack in a story that had held for 20 years. Osprith looked at me a long moment. Then he looked at Runna, and something crossed his broad, gray face that might, in a smaller man, have grown one day toward shame. You never said, he said to me low. "No," I said, "I never did. That was the coward's part of it. The order I could defend, the silence I cannot." I stepped between him and her door, my back to her, facing them all. "Go home. Ready the wall, and leave her be, by my word, and on my throat leave her be." They went, slowly muttering, the fear not gone but redirected, up toward the wall where it belonged. Osprith was the last to go, and he went, and I was left standing in the empty dark outside her door with the torches guttering out and the black harbor glassy and silent below us. I turned. She was still in her doorway, the knife lowered now, and she was looking at me the way she had looked at me across the dead flat that first morning, and the way she had looked at me when I said something else in her fire-lit room, as though I had done a thing she had stopped expecting anyone to do. Her eyes were bright, not with fear. She blinked hard twice and mastered it, because she had long ago learned not to weep where anyone could see. "You told them the truth," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. 20 years and no one," she stopped. "Why now?" "Because it is true," I said, "and because I am done being the kind of king who lets someone else drown so that I can keep dry." I came closer. The warm thing behind my ribs had grown a low, steady light in it, a pull, drawing me toward her the way the moon draws the tide, and I did not fight it, and I did not name it aloud, not yet, but I let it move me. "And because you were right in your doorway the first night, the hold will want someone to blame before they want someone to fight. I have decided which one I would rather be. It took me 20 years too long." It was quiet a moment. Then softly, "It will rise soon, tomorrow, perhaps the day after. It's nearly all the way awake." She looked out at the black glass harbor. "And when it comes, it will come as it came before, up out of the water into the low streets toward the wall, and your wolves will be afraid. And there is a thing you should know before it does, my king, because you'll have a choice to make, and you should make it knowing." She turned back to me. "It did not take me because I did not run in the flood. When the water came into the house, and my mother put me on the table, and the beast passed by outside, I was not afraid of it. I have thought about this every day for 20 years, and I am sure of it now. Everyone in that house was afraid, and the water took them. I sat on the table, and I looked at the wall the beast was passing behind, and I felt the old blood in me go quiet and still and unafraid, and the water rose to the beam over my head and would not cross me. It is not that the deep is my master. It is that the deep does not frighten me, and a thing that cannot make you afraid cannot altogether take you." She held up her wrist again, the silver whorl catching the last torchlight. "My mother said we were made to stand at the edge of the water. I think she meant it more truly than she knew. I think, my king, that when it rises I may be able to stand at the wall where the rest of you cannot. I may be able to face it. I don't know what that will buy, perhaps only a little time. But I have spent 20 years being blamed for surviving the deep, and I would rather spend whatever comes next finding out what surviving it was for." I looked at her, this small woman my hold had spat on for 20 years, standing in her poor doorway offering, without any fuss, to walk out and face the thing that had drowned us all, because she alone was not afraid of it. And the last of whatever I had told myself about the warmth behind my ribs fell away, and I knew it for what it was, plain and whole and undeniable. "Rana," I said. It was the first time I had spoken her name. "When it rises, you will not face it alone." "You are the king," she said gently. "You cannot promise that. Your first duty is the living. If the wall falls, you will have to call the fall back again, and you should." "When it rises," I said, "you will not face it alone. That is not a king's promise. It is mine, Torin's, and I mean to keep it, whatever it costs, because I have kept the other kind of promise all my life, the careful kind, the kind that saves the many and lets the one drown, and it has made me a man I can no longer stand to be." I took her hand, the marked one, and I turned it in mine and looked at the silver whorl, and I felt the mark on my own skin, the mate mark, the sleeping thing I had carried since I came of age and never once felt wake. I felt it warm and stir and begin, at last, after 20 barren years, to wake. "The moon made you for me," I said low, the truth of it aching in my chest. "I have known it since your fire the first night, and I have been too much a coward to say it, and I will not be a coward about this or about the beast, not any more. I do not ask you to answer it now. I do not ask you for anything. But you should know before the deep rises that there is one wolf in Saltvarn who does not think you cursed. He thinks you are the best thing the sea ever gave this coast, and he means to stand beside you when it comes. And he is sorry, he is more sorry than he has words for, that it took him 20 years to come to your door." She was weeping now openly, the tears she had not let anyone see in 20 years, and she was not trying to stop them, and she did not pull her hand from mine. "You cannot say that to me," she whispered. "You cannot. Do you know what they'll..." Let them, I said. Let the whole hold say what it likes. I am done living by what the hold will say. And I raised her marked wrist to my mouth and pressed my lips to the silver whorl, gentle, reverent. A king kneeling in his own way to the woman his hold had scorned. And the mark on my skin flared warm as a coal, and the bond between us, 20 years asleep, 20 years grieved for and given up on, sang awake and full and sure. And for the first time since the night the low hold drowned, the cold, empty place behind my ribs was not empty at all. It was full of her. We had 3 days. It rose on the third. I spent those days, as a king should have spent the years before them. I put every wolf who could stand on the gray wall, and I put every child and every elder up the high roads to the old fastness above the hold, where the highest tide could not reach. I had the barricades built and the spears sharpened and the great harbor chains, rusted 20 years in their housings, hauled up and stretched across the harbor mouth, a barrier of iron links each thick as my arm. It would not stop the sunder, I knew that. Nothing we had would stop the sunder, but it might slow it. It might buy the hold the time to empty if the wall failed. I did not intend to let the wall fail, but I had learned at last to prepare for the drowning I meant to prevent, and to do both at once, and not to lie to myself that either made the other unnecessary. And I did not hide her. That was the other thing. I brought Run-Up out of the omen huts and into the high hold into the light where the whole pack could see her, and I set her to the one task no one else could do, reading the deep. Twice a day she went out onto the gray wall and stood at its seaward edge, small against the gray, and laid her marked wrist to the cold stone, and told me what the deep was doing beneath the black water, how close, how deep, how nearly awake. And the wolves who had spat at her feet for 20 years watched their king stand beside her, unafraid, listening to her, deferring to her, and something in the hold began slowly to turn. Not all at once. Osprith still could not look at her without the old fear tightening his jaw. But others, the fisherwomen who had lost kin in the drowning, the young wolves born after it who knew the story but had never quite believed it, others began to bring her small things. A warmer cloak, a share of the catch, a place at the fire. 20 years of blame does not come off a soul in 3 days, but it began to come off. I saw it begin. On the third night she came to me on the wall, and her face was grave. "It's coming," she said. "Tonight. It's all the way awake and it's climbing." She looked out at the black harbor where the water lay flat and glassy and terrible under a sky with no moon, the same moonless dark, I realized with a lurch as the night it came before. It knows we're here. It's coming for the wall. I gave the orders. The horns went up and down the coast, low and mournful, and my hold woke to the old nightmare made new. The children hurried up the high roads, the elders after them, the fighting wolves streaming to the gray wall with spears and torches, the great chains hauled taut across the harbor mouth. I stood on the wall with my captains and my pack, hundreds of us along the black stone, and Runna stood beside me at the seaward edge with her hand on the parapet, and we waited, and the dark went on, and the sea lay glassy and still. And then out past the harbor mouth, the water began to lift. It rose the way I remembered it, a hill in the sea where no hill should be, a mounding of the black water, and then the top of that hill broke the surface and it was not water. It was hide, gray and vast and plated, streaming the sea off itself in waterfalls, rising and rising past all reason, blotting out the low gray line of the horizon, until it stood in the harbor mouth taller than the wall, a drowned mountain that moved, blind and armored and immense. And it opened whatever it had for a mouth, and it made that sound, that vast, low, drowning groan, the grief of the whole ocean given a voice. And I felt every wolf on the wall flinch back from it as one, the old terror going through us like cold water, and I felt it go through me too, the primal animal certainty that this thing could not be fought, could not be stopped, could only be fled. And I heard down the whole length of the wall the word begin, the word from 20 years ago, fall back, fall back, fall back. I heard it from my own captains. I heard it, worst of all, rising in my own throat, the order, the careful, terrible order that would save the many and drown the few, the order I had given before and could give again. The order that was, God help me, the correct order, because no wolf living could stand against that thing, and the only mercy left was to empty the hold and let the beast take the stone. And Runna let go of the wall and walked toward it. She did not tell me she was going. She did not look back. She stepped up onto the parapet of the gray wall, small and dark against the rising bulk of the sunder, and she walked out along the top of the wall toward the seaward gate, toward the harbor mouth, toward the beast, alone in her mended cloak. 20 years the drowned girl, 20 years the cursed omen. She walked out to meet the thing the whole hold was already fleeing, because she was the one wolf on that wall who was not afraid. And I understood, watching her go, in a single blinding instant, what a coward I had been my whole life. Because I had always thought the choice was between the many and the one, between calling the fall back and going down into the water, between the careful order that saved hundreds and the reckless love that would only add my own body to the drowned. I had built my whole kingship on that choice, and I had made it 20 years ago and told myself there had been no other. But there was another. There had always been another. The other choice was to stand. To stand at the wall and fight the thing instead of fleeing it, not to trade the one for the many, but to risk everything to save them all. It was the harder choice and the more frightening one, and it might well fail and take us all down together. And I had never once in 20 years been brave enough to make it. I had called it folly. I had called it a king's duty to be wiser than his courage. And a woman my hold had spat on for 20 years had just stepped up onto my wall and made it without a word, because she had spent her whole life being unafraid of the one thing the rest of us could not face. The fallback died in my throat. No, I roared instead, and it was not an order, it was a vow, and it rang down the gray wall over the drowning groan of the beast. SALTVARN, to the wall. We do not fall back, not tonight. Not again. And I ran up onto the parapet, out along the black stone after her, toward the gate and the beast, the mate mark blazing on my skin now like fire, the bond hauling me toward her, my whole pack staring, the word fall back dying half-spoken on 100 tongues as they watched their king run the wrong way, run toward the thing that had drowned us, run out to stand beside the drowned girl at the edge of the world. She had reached the seaward gate. She stood on the wall above the harbor mouth, and the sunder loomed over her, blotting out the sky, its blind, vast head lowering toward the tiny figure on the stone, that drowning groan building in it, and I saw her raise her marked wrist toward it, not to strike it. There was nothing on this earth she could strike it with, but to reach it, palm open, the way you reach a hand toward a frightened animal, the silver whorl on her wrist catching a light from somewhere that was not the moon, for there was no moon, and beginning to shine. And the beast stopped. The drowning groan died in its throat. The vast blind head hung over her, streaming seawater, and it went still. And I reached her side, gasping, the wall trembling under us with the nearness of the thing, and I put myself between her and the beast the way I should have put myself between the water and the lowhold 20 years ago, and she looked up at me, and she was not afraid, and she said, over the terrible silence of the stilled beast, "It's not a monster, Torin, it's lost. It's blind and it's ancient and it's in pain and it comes up out of the dark not to drown us but because it's dying down there and it can't find its way home and it doesn't understand where the light goes. Nobody has ever stood still enough for it to feel. Everyone runs, and a thing that only ever meets running looks like a monster." Her voice broke. "But I'm not afraid of it. I've never been afraid of it. And I think if I'm not afraid, and if you're not afraid, if we stand, we can turn it. We can send it home." I did not understand it. I do not fully understand it now. But I understood her, and I understood that the choice before me was, at last, the true one, not the many against the one, but everything staked on standing, and I made it. I put my hand over her marked wrist, my mate mark blazing against her moon blood, king and Luna, wolf and wolf, the bond between us a bridge of light, and I reached with her toward the vast, blind, dying thing that hung over my hold. And I was afraid. I was more afraid than I have ever been, and I did not run. I felt it then, through her, through the bond, through the old moon blood in her flowing into me. I felt what she felt. I felt the beast, and she was right. There was no malice in it. There was only a vast, ancient, drowning grief, a thing older than the coast, older than the wolves, lost in the black cold, deep, blind and hurting, and turning up toward the only light it could sense, the light of our hold, our fires, our lives, not to devour them, but to reach them, the way a drowning wolf reaches for a hand. And every time it rose, everyone fled, and it found only emptiness and stone where the light had been, and it groaned its grief and sank back into the dark, more lost than before. 20 years ago it had come up reaching, and we had fled, and it had blundered through our streets in its blind grief, and the sea had come in behind it, and we had called it a monster and a drowning, and it had been, in truth, a lost and dying thing that no one had been brave enough to stand still for. "Home," Runna whispered to it, her hand and mine raised together, the light of the bond and the moon blood pouring out of us toward the beast. "It's this way. Follow the light down, not up. Go home to the deep and be at peace. Nobody here will run from you again, but you cannot stay. Go home." And the sunder, the drowned mountain, the 20-year terror, the thing that had unmanned a king and cursed a child and drowned a hold. The sunder lowered its vast, blind head, and it made a sound I had never heard it make, not the drowning groan, but something lower and longer and almost gentle, a sound like a great weary sigh, like a lost thing finding at last the way home. And it turned. Slowly, immensely, streaming the whole sea off its flanks, it turned in the harbor mouth, and it began to sink, not to attack, not to flee, but to go down, following the light of the bond down into the black water, drawn home at last by the two wolves brave enough to stand at the edge and not be afraid. And the water closed over its plated back, and the terrible bulk of it sank and sank into the deep, and the drowning grief of it faded, and was gone down into the dark where it belonged. At peace. And the sea went still, truly still, the good stillness, the stillness after. And Runna fell. I caught her before she struck the stone. Whatever it had cost her, the reaching, the standing, the pouring out of the old blood to turn a thing the size of a mountain, it had cost her everything she had. She was gray and cold in my arms, her marked wrist gone dim, her breath a thin thread, her eyes fluttering. I went down on my knees on the wall with her gathered against my chest, and I heard my own voice break, calling her name, and I heard, all down the gray wall, the sound of hundreds of wolves who had watched the whole of it, watched the drowned girl walk out to meet the beast, watched their king run to stand beside her, watched the two of them turn the 20-year terror and send it home into the deep. I heard them make a sound of their own, a great ragged sound. Half grief and half something that had no name because the hold had never felt it before. Awe and shame, and the first breaking of a 20-year wrong. Stay, I said to her low, my mouth against her hair, the bond in me clutching at the failing bond in her. Runna, stay. You cannot walk out to meet the whole sea and then leave me on the wall. I forbid it. I am the king and I forbid it. Her eyes found mine dim, and one corner of her mouth moved, the ghost of a thing that on a better night would have been a smile. You cannot promise that, she had told me, you're the king, and I bent my brow to hers, and I did the only thing left to a wolf whose mate is slipping into the dark. I opened the bond all the way. I gave her everything I had. I poured myself down that bridge of light between us the way she had poured herself into the beast, my strength, my warmth, the whole hoarded life of a king who had spent 20 years too afraid to give anything away. I gave it all to her freely without counting the cost, the exact thing I had never done in the drowning, and I felt it flow into her, felt the thin thread of her breath catch and hold and deepen. And her marked wrist against my chest began faintly to shine again. She lived, she lives. It was days before she woke, and longer before she was strong, and there were nights in between when I did not leave her side and did not sleep and bargained with everything there is to bargain with. But she lived. The moonblood and the bond, and I like to think, a king who finally learned to give instead of guard, they brought her back to me. And the hold that had called her cursed for 20 years kept vigil outside her door the whole while, in the cold, in shifts, unasked. Osprith first. Osprith, who had led the crowd to her door with torches, sat outside it 3 nights running with his broad gray head bowed. And when she woke at last, he asked to be let in, and he knelt by her pallet, a captain, a proud old wolf kneeling, and he could not get the words out. And she reached up with her marked hand and touched his bowed head, and forgave him without making him find them, because that was the kind of soul my hold had spent 20 years spitting on. I made her my lunar at the turning of the season, on the mendied gray wall, above the calm harbor, before the whole assembled hold. There was no council parade of fine wolf women, no careful match of pack to pack. There was a woman in a cloak that was no longer mendied, but new, deep-water gray, and a silver whorl on her wrist that shone in the sun, and a king who stood beside her at the seaward edge of the wall, the edge she had taught him to stand at unafraid, and named her what she had always been, what the moon had made her, what his own cowardice had cost him 20 years of. My Luna, my mate. The bravest wolf in Saltvarn, who walked out to meet the beast the whole hold fled, and made her king brave enough to stand beside her. The hold knelt, all of them, not in fear this time, and not because a king commanded it, but freely, the way you kneel to a thing you finally understand you were wrong about. The fisher wolves and the war captains, the young and the old, the ones who had spat and the ones who had only watched and said nothing, which had been its own kind of spitting. They knelt to the drowned girl, and she looked out over them with those steady storm-gray eyes, and she did not gloat, and she did not weep, and she said only quietly so that I alone quite heard it. 20 years I wanted them to stop being afraid of me. I never once thought about what it would be to have them kneel. It isn't better, Torin, it's only different. What I wanted was to be let alone at the fire. That would have been enough. You will have the fire, I told her, And you will have far more than that all your life because you have earned it 100 times over, and I mean to spend the rest of mine making up the 20 years my hold owes you. But you will never again be let alone. That much I cannot give you. You are their Luna now. They will follow you into the sea itself, and they will be right too." She did not answer that. She only slipped her marked hand into mine, there on the wall above the calm, bright water, and leaned her small, warm weight against my side. And we stood together at the edge of the deep where she had taught me to stand, where the old moonblood in her line had always known to stand at the border of the water, unafraid. And we watched the good tide come in, gentle and unhurried, filling the harbor the way a thing fills a home. The deep has been quiet since. Some nights when the moon is dark, I go up onto the gray wall alone and I look out at the black water, and I think of the vast lost thing sleeping down there in the cold. And I do not feel the old terror anymore, only a strange and unexpected tenderness. For it was never a monster, only a lost and dying thing that no one had been brave enough to stand still for. And I think of the child on the table in the flooded house, dry-eyed in the throat of the drowning, unafraid where everyone else was afraid. And I understand at last that the thing my hold spent 20 years calling a curse was the only thing that ever had the power to save us. She did not survive the deep because she belonged to it. She survived it because she alone, of all of us, could meet it without running. And a king who could not do that himself blamed her for it, and let his hold blame her for it, for 20 years. And then, one moonless night, at the very edge of the world, she taught him how. I am Torin, the Alpha King of Saltfarn. I once stood on my wall and watched my hold drown and did not go down. That is the truth of me, and I will carry it to my grave, and I have made my peace with carrying it, because carrying it honestly is the least a coward owes his dead. But it is not the only truth of me anymore. There is another, newer one, and I hold to it on the dark nights harder than I hold to the old shame. It is this, that when the deep rose a second time, and the word fall back was rising in my throat as it had risen before, a small, brave woman my whole hold had scorned stepped up onto my wall and walked out to meet the beast alone. And that this time, God be thanked, this time I did not stay dry on my wall and let her go down alone into the water. This time I ran to her side. This time I stood,